So get the best out of Crystal. My idea with that was looking at the tiny things, like small issues that can sometimes make a huge impression. So with this talk, I'm gonna introduce some cases of like Crystal examples where it makes sense or made sense to look a bit deeper about what's going on and break down what's happening there. So just stories. So we encounter lots of bugs every day in our lives. Like we are working on the standard library, the compiler, but this is true for like every code base. Like none is bug free. But what are the reasons for bugs happening? So sometimes it's maybe just simple typos or whatever. There's some forgotten edge case. But sometimes there's something more behind it. So on another level that something went wrong for a specific reason, maybe. So I'll be talking about some examples that we had in the last couple of months, or maybe some will remember the discussion about enumerable.any. There's a long common thread on that. So this was initially the discussion on Amoeba, the linter tool, which has a rule that says use or you shouldn't use any, instead you should use not empty. So if a linter says one method from the standard library, you shouldn't use that, and maybe that something's wrong with that method, or it definitely doesn't make sense to have such a rule in the linter, I would say, because either the method is good or it's not good, and if it's not good, then maybe it shouldn't be there in the first place, and the linter shouldn't have to worry about it. In general, this proposal from Amoeba to use not empty might sound good. We could more into that later, but if you look at it, it's more complicated. Like there's a visual distance between the negation and the actual method that you call, and like if the object, the receiver is more complex, like could be a chain of calls already or whatever, and it just gets messy that way. Also hard to write with short code block syntax or whatever. So, but what's the problem with any? Well, it operates on truthiness, not on the size of an enumerable. So you can have an enumerable with a couple of values, and any will tell you it doesn't have anything. Which I guess this semantics makes some sense, but it's often not that what you want. That's the reason for Amoeba recommending to use not empty, because usually you expect any to say that there is something, even if it's nil or false or pointer that points nowhere. So I sparked this discussion and went on with 30 comments, whatever, on the forum, and different ideas on what to do with it. And well, lately we came up with just add a new one, present, to do what most people would probably expect of any, which is just the opposite of empty. This is new in Crystal 1.11, then upcoming release, we'll have that. So maybe that problem is solved, but we could still ask, like, what's about any? Do we even need that? Maybe, probably less than Ruby, but these semantics come from, because in Ruby you more often have like arrays with nil values in them. In Crystal, through static typing, that's less common, I guess. So maybe we don't need any, but that's a different story. We can think about it. Next thing is looping. The yield keyword, Alexander mentioned that earlier, that it's super useful, and it is. But you also have to be a bit careful about it, like what's happening around it. So we had a bug in the standard library. Actually, this is just a very short example, which should show like what's happening here. So we have a simple struct, a method that counts, and it yields like as you would expect, maybe 10 times. And at the end, the counter is 0. So looks well defined, I guess, and self-contained, and does the job. But can anyone spot an issue with this implementation? Already mentioned that yield is the topic of this section. So when you yield, you give up control. Yield can introduce side effects. So what's happening here is that we're calling the method again inside the yielded block, and at the end the thing runs only once, and the counter is -0, something that you would not expect from looking at the code, probably. So if yield happens, anything can happen. I mean, this is not a super specific problem, because if you would call into a method that could also do something that alters your environment in the yield thing, but you have more control of it, and you would need to have a reference from the other method and whatever. With yield, it's more close by. Like in the calling code, you just have that c.count call nested in each other. There's nothing to prevent you from doing that, and it looks good on the calling side. So what's the problem? Yeah, but it doesn't work that way. So yield is great and useful, and I wouldn't recommend like not using it, but if you use it, be a bit defensive about what's the state of the environment after yield returns. So you may notice that the while counter is already a bit defensive. Like if I would have put in there the comparison counter not equals 0, then we would have a lot of fun, because that thing would run till the negative value of int. It will never stop and then overflow. So that counter greater than 0 is also already a stopgap to prevent like the worst thing happening here. So remember, yield can introduce side effects that you may not be aware of. And even like in this example, we are using a struct, so not even a class. With a class, you can even have more things more easily, I guess, because they're more accessible from other places due to being a reference and not a value. Next story, it's a bigger one maybe. It's about predicate methods on the file module. So this was also sparked by a bug in the compiler. Just show a little example of the diff that fixed the bug. There was a call to file.exists, checking if some path exists in the file system. And we had to change it to something else, in this case file.file, because exists checks if something exists at that location, and that something might be a directory. But we're here in the code for like the require functionality of the compiler. So, and if you require a directory that doesn't make sense, you want to require a file. So yeah, that should only consider files and not directories. So this is obviously the code that called that was misusing the IPI method. File.exists wasn't adequate for this case. And we could ask ourselves, like, if this happens in the compiler code with like the same code base, and well, that ideally shouldn't happen, that you misinterpret what the method does, but of course it happens, but maybe that's something to the method that defines that's wrong or could be improved. So I was thinking, is there more to it? Like, looked at other uses in the standard library or in the compiler, and yeah, there are lots of similar methods. File.file, file exists, file readable, file directory, they're all related in many ways, and I looked at how they're called, and well, more often than not, it's a bit wanky, not using really the correct version of these methods. So I expect that probably in other code bases, the situation might be similar, and maybe we should do something about it. So of these 4 methods, I think only directory is really uncontroversial, because that's pretty clear. Check if something is a directory, and if not, then it's not, and it's clear what a directory is, usually. What's file.file also seems like good, easy definition. We had used it as a solution earlier, but it's actually not the ideal solution. So we should probably improve that. And the problem with this method in particular is that the name file is a bit ambiguous. So what is a file? In the first sense, it's everything that can be in a file system. So we have a directory, it could be a symlink, or more special things like a named pipe, a device file, or like the ordinary file that you would expect, like the Crystal source code file. That's maybe the smaller meaning of file, but everything that at least can be considered a file, just files of different types. So we already know that file.file is not a directory, because we used that earlier to not have directories in that compiler code. Symlink we can also ignore, because these methods usually resolve symlinks, so they just point to something else of the others. That leaves us with 3 items here. They are all collectively can be called a file as opposed to directory, and that's a different meaning from what file.file, the method, has of a file. So yeah, named pipe, just to make sure that's something you can. It's a first in, first out stream basically on the file system. Your shell usually creates one implicitly for you if you pipe a command as an argument into some other command. The device file is basically the entire dev tree on a Unix system, with very special things going on there, character devices, proc devices, all that kind of stuff. And then there's the ordinary file, and the ordinary file is the only thing that file.file considers. But in many cases, where you want to read from a file maybe or something, then it doesn't matter whether it's like that kind of ordinary file, or if it's a named pipe or a device file, whatever. Like, look at the named pipe shell example. Like, if someone wants to pipe output that way into like your command line application instead of like a file path for an ordinary file, then that should be okay. We shouldn't limit that usually. So to cover all these different types, it's better to use, instead of file.file, to check if it exists and it's not a directory. So that's also a bit complicated, but that's usually, I would say, the more correct meaning, or that's what most code is intended to have here. Maybe we can find a shortcut for this functionality, but of course naming is hard, and we have the existing methods, which is with their existing meaning, which is not easy to change. So yeah, I don't know. I'm open for suggestions. Maybe think about it. I'll take them at the end. Next one is file readable. What does it do? I mean, guess it tells if you can read from a file, and it suggests itself that it's somehow related to file read, which does read from a file. So yeah, I mean, this looks pretty nice. You check if a file is readable, and if yes, then you read it. So optional file loading, totally easy code, should work, right? No, it doesn't, because file readable returns true on a directory, and then you try to read it, but you can't read it from a directory. So there's another ambiguity here, because file readable is about access permissions. So a directory usually has this readable flag because you needed to enumerate its children. But file.read is about reading the content of a file, which a directory does not have, so it won't work if you want to read from it. I think this is quite a misleading situation and probably confusing if you hit that issue with trying to read from a directory and not being able to do that. The semantics of these methods are completely inherited from Ruby, but I couldn't find anything on Ruby, like someone complaining about these issues, so I don't know what's the story there, but I find it a bit disturbing because it so suggests itself that it's related, but it really isn't. Anyway, what you really want to do, again, is instead of readable, probably you want to combine that with the previous check, that it's file and it exists, and that you can read from it. Can shorten that a bit, because file exists and readable are really doing the same thing in that way. We don't need the exists, but it's again a bit bunky thing, and yeah, you can check file readable and not a directory, and then you can probably read from it. There might still be some file system driver issues or whatever, but usually that gives you a file of the kind that can be read from. Same story, maybe we could find a shorter version for that. Next story, I've been working a bit on compiler tools lately, and I noticed the code for parsing command line arguments in the compiler is really a bit nasty. So I'll just show this is a very, very short version of the structure. Consider this just being 300 lines longer and having more if statements and whatnot, and more complex code to handle all the values. It's very imperative to set up. We're using the option parser tool from standard library, which is, I guess, okay, it gets the job done. And I think many other command line tools are using something similar. But I mean, imperative is great, but I would be happy if we could make it more declarative, maybe. And if you look at this structure, you have a bit of like a setup of variables, then some mapping from the command line arguments to those variables, and then at the end you pack them together in a struct or class, and yeah, you return them. This structure actually looks pretty similar to what you would do for like something like JSON deserialization. If you hadn't had JSON serializable, which is super useful for this kind of thing. Just comparison. Yeah, I mean the sender part is a bit different, but it's just about like the option parser uses callbacks, and here we are just looping through an iteration and just checking the value. So it's basically doing the same stuff, just a different mechanism, but the overall structure is identical. So maybe we should have something like that JSON serializable for command line arguments. I mean, it would make sense. Command line arguments are serialized form of a general configuration format, so deserializing that could be in a way done that's similar to JSON serializable. So I looked at a couple of shards. There's lots of CLI parsing shards, but none of them really does that. I think Athena console has a bit of that, but it's maybe a bit more heavy. I don't know. But yeah, and the others are doing maybe similar stuff, but with their own DSLs for that, whatever, and it's not really very approachable. Like JSON serializable is just plain Ruby Crystal class struct, and you just put You include a module and maybe add some annotations here and there, and it just works. It unfolds everything, maps the values, and then it works. Maybe we can do something similar for command line arguments. I don't know. We'll see. That would be an idea for the future. Yeah, and that's all the examples I have today. My call to you is keep your eyes open. If you see some code that looks a bit iffy, I don't know, then think about why. Like, what's going on there? Is it just a simple bug maybe that I need to fix, just the value here or there or whatever? Or is there some deeper reason why things are not going the way that maybe they were intended to go? Thanks for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
All right. So I have a suggestion here from a user. Next time, bring your hat. Do we have questions in the room? I would like to say that this kind of little things that you find in the standard library, these kind of inconsistencies, I was thinking, okay, if readable gives you true when it's a directory, that's a bug. But what if you are intending to actually consider the read flag in the chmod in the what's called the permissions?
Yeah, access permissions. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So this is this tension, and you have to figure out the names. Someone suggested a name actually for the file issue. Really, a file? That would be like.
Yeah.
Actually, a file, I think is probably better.
Filey file, yeah. Filish, I don't know. Like. Yeah, we can talk about that online, I guess. Some issue that needs to be created. Okay.
All right.
How do you track? So I think this focus on really minute changes is really important. It's fantastic that we see that in the Crystal community. But when you're looking at breaking changes, how are you going to be thinking about that? And are you considering them at this point, or not trying to avoid?
Okay, so the question is about breaking changes, whether I consider them or we consider them at this point or not. Generally, yeah, we do breaking changes in a way, or at least prepare them with deprecating stuff. That's like the first step for breaking something. We say now that it's gonna be removed at some point. That point would be like the next major version, 2.0, at whatever time that arrives. We don't know. So we're definitely doing that. So if we, like, for example, in emerald.any, if we would come to the conclusion that this method is more harmful than it helpful, then maybe it would best to deprecate that and remove it eventually, just to prevent people from falling into traps with it. Yeah, totally open for that. It just won't happen like immediately. And anything that would need more like short-term changes is probably like at this point it's hard. I mean, this is particularly important, I guess, for changes to existing stuff. Like if we take file.file, if we wanted to change the meaning of that would be super annoying because some code probably depends on the specific meaning it has right now. So I think we can't really change that method to different semantics, but yeah.
I would like to extend on that, saying that sometimes we find that something is a bug, right? And we're changing the meaning, but the usage that bad usage that you can use with it is clearly a bug. No one should have used it that way. Then we go ahead and do the breaking change in a sense. but you have to be careful, right? The file readable is a good example because originally, as he was talking, I said, but that's a bug. We should simply say, okay, no, if it's that directory, we just return false. Or raise an exception, I don't know. But then I said, oh, wait, if people are using it from the access control list point of view, then that's perfectly acceptable. Then that will be a major breaking change, so we cannot do that.
Yeah, it's definitely not a bug.
It's not a bug,
because it works according to the documentation. So like if the documentation says that's what it does, then that's what it should do. Like
exactly.
People should be able to depend on that. Yeah.
Any more questions?
Sure, we have time. Yeah. Yeah, maybe Peter, can you get in the microphone? That's easier. Should be long enough.
What are your thoughts on like having two different ways to do something? So, for example, in the option parser, like maybe that's you think there's a better way of doing that, but it's a totally different API, or maybe something about like the HTTP library. I don't know. Maybe it's not an evolution, but it's like a different thing. And how do you avoid like a fragmentation? And do you allow two ways of doing the same thing in the standard library?
Yeah.
Because I'm kind of thinking from a Ruby perspective, the standard library doesn't change, and so we have huge numbers of gems that kind of try to fix it, and that's not a good situation.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the general philosophy of Crystal is ideally not to have aliases, and I would extend that a bit to like having just different meanings or different ways to do the same stuff. And like really, I would wonder if the standard library should have like two means, like if they're comparable, like equivalent, just different ways to do the same thing, then I don't see much point in it. Then it's probably better to just have one and try to get everyone using that one instead of having two. And then you can have the other as a external shard, whatever. Like if you want to use that, you should be able to, no problem. But with the selection of libraries that are part of the standard library, we should set some generically commonly accepted base that people can use, should use, and we as a community all agree on that. That's a good thing to use that. If you don't need something special, if you need something else, then go ahead and use something else, of course. You wanted to say something, or
just a comment from YouTube from Kevin. He's saying that in documentation you can put all these caveats, right? Like for readable, for instance, you say, okay, if it's a directory, we'll say true, so be aware. So this is a good point to make. Still, that requires users to read the documentation, which is, of course...
yeah. Documentation is quite a bit removed from the actual code. Like even if you had like a good integration into an IDE, which like shows you the documentation summary on Hover or whatever, still if you look at the code as it is, you're not thinking about the documentation unless you're really familiar with the documentation, or you're not familiar with it at all, and you have to look it up. But if you see code like the one we had before, with just file.readable ? And then file.read, I mean, this makes totally sense. It looks like it should work the way that it's probably intended, but it doesn't, and no documentation can really fix that it's just misleading on this very high level look at it.
All right.
Of course, adding these caveats in the documentation is the first step to help people recognize this. Yeah, definitely. But we hope we can maybe do more to make it easier for people.